we talked about how the artillery moved further away, and they realized that Barrage, by 1917, this is the barrage map for Vimy Ridge. By this point, the use of a creeping barrage was the tactic that was used. So after the British emerged from the shell crisis of 1915, where essentially they ran out of bullets and guns were giving rates of fire of like 2 to 3 rounds per day was all that was allowed. And the entire, I can't even remember the prime minister's name, but the entire government fell on this. And it wasn't until somebody gripped British industry and they started making enough shells because they realized weight of fire and rate of fire was absolutely key. And what was thought was going to be just at the start, as I said, direct fire, open ranges. You'll fire maybe a dozen rounds, and that was it. Now they're firing hundreds of rounds per day, and the end result was they realized, as I mentioned, that they had to suppress the enemy, not necessarily destroy him. And they came up with the rolling barrage or creeping barrage, which would essentially go in front of the assaulting infantry and suppress the enemy. So there was a layered effect, though. You have 18 pounders and 4.5-inch howitzers would be firing this kind of suppressing barrage. Meanwhile, further on, there'd be 6-inchers and 60 pounders that were firing. But they also the larger guns like the 9-inch guns and whatnot. They would be firing concentrations on, as I said, important tactical sites, whether they're headquarters or phone junctions or anything like this. So by April 1917, using the creeping barrage was key. So essentially what you see here is the barrage map from Vimy Ridge. Each one of those squiggly lines that move, if you read it from left to right, those are the lifts. And so it lifted 100 yards every 4 minutes, I believe is what the timing was, if I remember correctly. The black lines that you see that kind of run perpendicular to those squiggly lines, those are the division markings. So from in the south, it would go 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th division.
Okay.
And then each divisional artillery headquarters would assign all of the brigades of the artillery a section of those lines. So, those, and it doesn't figure here, but a brigade would get a certain part of that line and they would be responsible for what was termed their lane. That was their lane of that lift. And so in their command posts, the artillery officers would calculate what the guns would have to fire on to hit that. And then each one of those lifts would be calculated beforehand. So when I talked about how monotonous it got for a gunner, and you saw that very first photo or one of the first ones we saw with the 18 pounder with all the stocked ammunition, that would all be prepared. And then, they would start firing at 0 hour, and then they would just fire for hours at a time. And the sergeant and the detachment commander would be watching his watch. He'd order a change in elevation. The elevation would change, and then they just keep on firing.
So,
And that's essentially the whole point was the infantry would follow as close as possible to that. And it was called closing up or hugging the barrage. And the intent was they would be so close behind it as close as safely possible, so that when it lifted off of the German trench lines, before the Germans could readopt their firing positions, the infantry would jump in the trenches and be right on top of them. That was the science of it. In fact, the French went so far as to say that 15% of their casualties should be caused by their own barrage. That's how close they were supposed to be to their barrage. Also called leaning into the barrage. That's a little bit much for me, but that's how they thought it would be, and you'd be right on it. So it would lift, and the Germans would come up, and the Canadian infantry or the British infantry would be right on top of them. Just an interesting aside, in the lead up to Vimy Ridge, each division was tasked to fire 2 practice barrages, and then in order just to rehearse, and then there was one core practice barrage. All these were conducted before actual zero day. But what they would do is they would fire on a German trench line, move forward a little bit, and then go back on the German trench line, ostensibly to catch the Germans when they came out of their dugouts. But what they were really doing is they were training the Germans to think that that was going to happen. So the Germans said, "Aha!" So when the fire lifted on the day, the Germans did not readopt their firing position because they thought the fire would return onto it after it lifted. But on the actual day, on Z day, when they actually launched the attack, it just kept rolling. And so the intent was to trick the Germans staying in their dugout, expecting it to come back, but instead it was Canadian infantry jumping into the trench lines. So it worked rather well. A little bit of a little deceitfulness on the part of the Canadian gunners in that regard.
It's pretty wild. If I recall right, I was watching a documentary about how the infantry would practice this. Like, and I think one of the hardest things was to keep them at a walking pace or staying behind the barrage and not
Mm-hmm.
rushing ahead and getting enveloped by their own artillery.
Yeah. Exactly, and it was all about practice. And by this point in the war in 1917, uh, we had got these things down pat. So this was I argue in my book Iron Indignation that this is the high water mark of the phase of artillery destruction in the First World War. It didn't last long. Very shortly after the preliminary bombardment of Vimy Ridge was 20 days long, and they fired thousands, maybe millions of shells in that time frame. But then after that, they started to use predicted fire a little bit more. They wanted to emphasize surprise a little bit more. But at this point in the war in April 1917, it was all about just pounding, pounding the objective with artillery leading up to it.
So just make sure I'm understanding this. So prior to the battle, I guess the battery commanders, they would have this map or their section, and then the lines. There was timings associated with all of these, right? And a
Exactly.
distance, and they had to follow that process to, and then
Exactly. So it's hard to see here, but in each one of those lines, there's an actual timing for when it had to be engaged.
you see down
And
here.
yeah, exactly. So in each one of the battery command posts, they would calculate that, and the guns would fire on that, and then it was. I don't know if they went quite so far as I'm assuming they did, that they would produce a gun program. What we do now is we produce a gun program, which we hand to the detachment commander, and it tells the detachment commander exactly what to fire, when to fire, what target and stuff and whatnot. He has no idea or they have no idea what they're firing at. They just have the coordinates and all the other technical information. And it's the same here, but this went on for hours. So you can imagine, kind of the monotony of the gunners, and that's all they're doing for hours at a time is just load, fire, load, fire, load, fire, load, fire, elevate, load, fire, just go on and on and on.
Well, just I've heard of the creeping barrage, but I had no idea that there was so much laborious work that went into the planning of it. And that a document like this would exist.
Mhm.
That's quite incredible.
Well, and it's because you could do, and which was done, but it was rare. Essentially, just a hasty creeping barrage where you all you do is you just kind of elevate and stuff. So you don't need to calculate. You just maybe give it a crank or so every 4 minutes. But it's not very scientific. It doesn't move with the pace of the infantry necessarily. But also, what you see here, the reason it's not just straight lines and turns and whatnot is because both the enemy trench lines influenced it and also the just the contours of the ground. And so that's why it's not just straight north south lines that would probably have been easier to fire, but not as effective. The worst part about the barrage map is that many of these lines uh, were nowhere near the enemy, so we didn't know, or the Canadians didn't know exactly where all the enemy were located. The enemy would sometimes put machine gun nests in between trench lines, uh, but that's why they fire. So I don't even know what percentage, but a very high percentage of the rounds that were fired didn't land anywhere near a German. But it was all about suppressing anything that might be in between trench lines as it advanced.
All right. And then was it like a, a single veil of explosions, like not very thick, or was there like suppressing fire that went deeper too, and then the creeping
Yeah,
barrage kind of marked the back end of the barrage where the infantry was advancing.
yeah, it was layered. So what they would do is the front end, the closest end would be the 4.5 inch and the 18 pounders, because they were the safest. I'll say that they're the danger, the blast area from their projectiles were the smallest. So the infantry could get the closest to it. And then a couple hundred meters yards in front were the 6 inchers, and then so they layered it, and the whole thing moved like that. And eventually, at the same time, some of these lines, I couldn't tell you which ones, were standing barrages. So the difference between a rolling or a creeping barrage, where it kind of moves, and a standing barrage is a standing barrage. It would just land on one line, and it wouldn't move at all. So those were lined up along the German trench lines. So those were called the standing barrage. So as the creeping barrage started, other guns, more usually the larger caliber ones, were firing standing barrages in depth on the German trench lines. And then as the creeping barrage moved up and hit that trench line, they would pause there for a bit, and then it would all lift off, and they would just keep going. So by the time you got to the end of this, to the far right of the map, you'd have it would all the fire would have accumulated along the way, up until the very end, especially in the northern parts where you see him. I keep pointing at the screen like you can see what I'm doing, but in the northern parts, the third and fourth Canadian divisions, they didn't have very far to go, so all of their artillery could reach all the way to the what they call the I think it's the black line, which is the final
Yeah,
line, or no,
that's
that's the black line. Sorry, I think the brown or maybe the blue line is the last line that you see
there's that
there.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the first and the second divisions, the two southernmost divisions that you see there, it was much further. So they actually had extra artillery assigned to them, and they were in what they call silent batteries. So not all of the 18 pounders could reach out to that final line on the far east or the far right line that you see there. So those silent batteries, they would wait, and then when it was their turn, they would just start firing, and take up where the 18 pounders that were further behind had run out of range. And at that point, those 18 pounders would then limber up and be prepared to move forward, because the key thing was, uh, as soon as they took the ridge, they knew there was going to be counterattacks, so they wanted to have guns in place to fire in depth into the back, what they call again the back country, as the Germans formed up to counterattack. So yeah, it was pretty fascinating stuff.